He stepped into the club like a man who had rehearsed invisibility for years. The room breathed smoke and neon. A jazz trio held the corners together, while the center swelled with men in dark suits and women in satin. Glasses winked. A wall of laughter folded over the bar. At the heart of it, in a raised circle of leather chairs, the old mob boss sat like an immovable island. He had the kind of face that led to stories, sharp nose, thinner smiles, and a laugh that could split a room in two. Dean's suit was wrong for the place. It hung a beat behind the swagger of the others, a blunt cut where there should have been silk, a threadbare lapel catching the light like a small betrayal. The jacket did not speak money. It suggested thrift, thriftless comfort, someone more accustomed to counting receipts than to buying time. Heads turned because something never quite right is always interesting. Heads turned harder when the boss laughed. "That suit," the boss said, loud enough for the circle to lean. "Where'd you get it? Off a charity rack?" The laugh spread, not cruel, but proprietary, the sound of a man reminding the room who held the ledger. Plates paused mid-raised, cigarette smoke braided with the mockery. Then the boss leaned back, elbows on velvet, adding the kind of slow, practiced smile meant to settle people into their places. Dean didn't flinch. He let the laugh roll over him like water. His hands were empty. He did not smooth the jacket or straighten his collar. For a moment it looked like he might be the one to leave, embarrassed and small. That, precisely, is why no one moved. When he spoke, his voice was even and quiet, like someone reading the room rather than shouting at it. "You can laugh at the jacket," he said. "You're sitting on what I paid for." Silence didn't so much fall as arrange itself. Conversations contracted. The band stilled a beat and then kept time at a lower volume as if some invisible metronome had slowed. People looked at each other. The boss's smile thinned, not with anger so much as calculation, and the cluster of men at his side checked their watches against the new headline Dean had just written. Nobody moved. Then the room learned how to listen. If this one grabs you, like and subscribe. We break down the twist that turned a joke into a throne. The line was almost nothing. It was the kind of sentence a man who has practiced quiet can pinch out between cigarette puffs. It had no swagger, no open boast. It did not deny the ridicule. It redirected it. It did more than that. It made the old boss feel small in the particular currency the room cared about but rarely spoke, the unseen ledger. The image it planted was simple and precise. The boss ran the visible show. Dean controlled the seams. The club belonged to the boss in exactly the way a suit belongs to a man. Seen, admired, a sign of place. What Dean claimed, with half a breath, was a system. He suggested he understood the pipes below the marble and the hands that kept them turning. He hinted at ledgers that did not hang on walls and promises kept in basements. He implied abundance without waving it. He exposed a vulnerability the boss had never thought to hide, that his chair had cost someone money someone else could track, and a man who could write checks for chairs was not a man to be laughed at. In the minutes that followed, the club rearranged itself around that sentence. Old grudges quieted, new attentions sharpened. The boss met Dean's gaze, and something like respect, narrow, careful, newly wary, passed between them. Not reverence, not friendship, but a recalibration, the kind of move that says, "I have to think before I laugh now." The crowd's reaction was a chorus of small things, a cigarette dug deeper into a mouth, a hand tucked into a coat, a woman shifting so her shoulder hid a smile. One of the boss's lieutenants, a broad man with a scar by his left ear, stood and approached as if to puncture Dean's claim with force. He got 3 steps and then stopped, their eyes meeting and stopping each other like 2 signals crossing. That single sentence had the precision of a blade. It didn't cut, it redefined. Dean had never liked to be the front. He preferred the maps that never left his desk, the names that lived in the margins, the people who answered when he called. The club that night was only theater. His real work had been elsewhere long before the jackets and the laughter. but he had learned the most important lesson early on. Respect is a pocket currency, exchangeable in the right place for safety, influence, fear, or favor. Spend it publicly and it buys headlines. Invest it quietly and it buys infrastructure. He carried a reputation like a hidden weapon, low-profile gestures that became stories, stories that became warnings. The morning after the club, the rumor would not be the cheap suit. It would be the way the boss now checked which chairs in his circle were paid for. That is how legends start, on the polite side of a joke and the practical side of a ledger. 2 years earlier, a scene that looked similar on its surface had done what the night's sentence did in seconds. It had been a funeral in a storefront church at the end of a block where people knew too many names and no one knew what to do with the debts. The preacher had said the right things. The family had cried in the right places. But there had been a smell of something unsettled in the room, the kind of pressure that arrives when bills outnumber visitors. Nobody expects a man in thrift to move mountains for strangers. They expect meanness or absence. Instead, Dean arrived with a parcel plain enough to be overlooked. He did not make a speech about community or loyalty. He folded his hands, placed the parcel by the casket, and sat at the back as the family shuffled past, reading the faces like a map of future loyalties. The parcel had been small, more symbolic than ostentatious, and that was the point. It was a deliberate piece of theater disguised as charity. It said to everyone in the room, "This man noticed. This man has resources and no need to prove them with bluster." It told people something far sharper than money ever could, that Dean's balance sheet had human consequences. The gesture solved one problem publicly and hinted at many more privately. By the time the preacher paused to read the name on the register, the rumor had already grown teeth. It was not a robbery of grief. It was a purchase of silence. People with problems find one person to go to when the public options are closed. When the parcel was discovered, the family named him a benefactor, the neighborhood named him a fixer, and the street named him a man who could be counted on. That day bought him a reputation. That reputation bought him time. Reputation is fragile. It is earned with precision and can be deflated with a single misstep. Dean knew this, so he built method after method to guard what he had bought. He hired faces to stand in windows. He placed talkers where there needed to be noise. He invested in people who looked good at the right events, flamboyant lieutenants who laughed loud and took the heat. Let them be seen. Let them take the slaps and the jeers. Meanwhile, Dean's money moved like sediment, unseen, necessary. He preferred the quiet. It was his art, arranging the mesh so the city never saw the knots and only noticed the seams. When problems came, they found solutions that happened out of sight. He never wanted applause. He wanted obedience. Applause can be fickle. Obedience builds walls. There was a lieutenant, Marco, bright and quick, who wore suits like armor and smiles like an invitation. Marco took the lead in public, threatening at the right bars, buying favors for the right referees, always with a flourish that said this family was to be feared and admired in equal measure. People loved Marco on television. They loved the rumor of him in clubs. He was a billboard for Dean's interests. Dean liked Marco's flash because it did two things. It distracted attention from the men who did the bookkeeping, and it made him predictable in the ways he needed to be. Marco would be seen, photographed, and rumored about, and thereby served as a buffer. It was a clever division of labor. The public face got the paper cuts, the private hand got results. But the world in which Dean operated had 1,000 natural enemies. Pride lived in other men, and arrogance wore many suits. A rival from the borough over, call him Vinny, a man with a lighter laugh and lighter morals, found opportunities in small provocations. Vinny had tried to recruit a restaurant owner who owed rent. He had threatened to ruin him if he didn't switch allegiances. The owner called Dean in the middle of the night. Dean listened. He did not fly into curses or make grand promises. He listened, mapped the loyalty, and then dealt quietly. When Vinny came to the restaurant to collect his signal, the lights were on as usual. The owner greeted him with a stiff smile, and said he had already signed an agreement with another sponsor. Vinny, sure of his leverage, barked and demanded explanations. The owner shrugged helplessly and suggested Vinny look at the local paper for his explanation. The story that morning was short and brutal. A fund had been set up to support small businesses damaged by the recent raids, the headline wrote itself, and Vinny had no name attached to any of it. Vinny could not buy the narrative. The public had shifted. The owner was now covered. The real move had been a quiet transfer of insurance and a named guarantor that no one but a few people knew to check. No violence, no threats, just a small, correct allocation that left Vinny with nothing to hold. That was Dean's specialty. He preferred to neutralize with paperwork and with relationships. He wasn't above force. There were men he kept for that when it was necessary. But his pride was in making a crisis evaporate without a gunshot. The most effective intimidation is the one that rewrites the ledger quietly. The boss in the club had seen those moves before. He had been burned by men who thought their loudness equaled ownership. The new wrinkle Dean introduced was that he was always ready to concede the spotlight, so long as he kept the scaffolding. He allowed Marco to go on the radio and make bold claims. He allowed his lieutenants to stand like carved saints in public, taking the heat and collecting the applause. Then he stepped in when pattern emerged, not to call attention to himself, but to make sure the patterns bent in a profitable direction. It is an old rule in his business. Never let the room know which chair you paid for until you want the room to believe you own the whole house. Dean's line in the club that night did not tell anyone he owned the house. It only reminded them that he had paid for the furniture. After the funeral that first time, other things followed. The rumor mill is greedy and efficient. Word moved in a dozen tiny directions. The way he handled the debt collection for a storefront. The way he quietly paid a bodega's legal fees. The time he personally saw a worker back on his feet after a bad fall. Those stories stitched together into a fabric that made men hesitant to mock him. They found it safer to accept his gestures as given, because in Dean's economy, generosity and leverage carried the same meaning. A hand extended could become a contract, and a contract could be enforced. There was an art to being invisible that required discipline. Dean kept lists, names of allies, names of betrayals, dates to revisit, but he did so mentally, not on paper. When he did inscribe anything, he used people as his record keepers. He made sure that promising men had a stake in silence. Loyalty, for him, was a distributed ledger of favors owed and favors returned. He treated it like infrastructure. Build it, maintain it, let it hum unnoticed. Still, not all tests are solved by money or favors. Some tests arrive in rooms like the club, in words and leers. Power is a performance as much as an account balance. The boss, who had ruled the room with the gravity of a well-worn chair, had been taught to believe his laugh held power. Dean, who could have left after being mocked, stayed and refused to contest the joke on its own terms. He refused the bait to be loud. He didn't call the boss names or throw his own. He spoke in a way that forced the boss to see himself through another lens. Not as a king, but as a man sitting on rented support. That was the real trick. You don't confront a tyrant where he expects it. You show him a mirror made of what he values most. Dean's line did that. It didn't say, "I'm richer than you," or "I'm smarter than you." It simply suggested that the boss's authority had an owner unknown to him. That is a more unsettling thing than any direct insult. The idea that the throne can be traced to a practitioner, someone who can unbuild what looks solid. The club staff began to move differently that night. Bartenders who had once welcomed the boss with certain affection now took Dean's order first. Guest lists were rewritten in tiny margins. A promoter who had once traded favors with the boss now looked at Dean before confirming bookings. The boss counted all these things with narrowed eyes. He was not yet defeated. He could still call favors of his own. But the seed of doubt had been planted. In time, doubt grows teeth. Dean's confidant, a woman named Renata, watched the whole exchange with the careful distance of someone who had seen men's reputations pass through the mill. She had been by his side since before the parcels and the quiet accounts, a partner who managed the human part of his ledger. While he preferred structures, she preferred people. She saw the frailty that lined even the most formidable faces and knew how to patch it. After the club, she touched Dean's sleeve lightly and said, "You turned a joke into a mortgage." He smiled very faintly. "I didn't want to make an enemy out of him. Just a neighbor who knows his house is on a foundation someone else paid for." "I don't like neighbors," she said. "They make you check your locks." He liked that she said that. He liked that she could look him in the eye and talk about risk like a woman naming weather. He trusted her because when things moved into danger, she was always the sober voice. She'd stop him from buying things that made sense to his wallet and not to his safety. For a while it worked. Dean's pattern of staying quiet but decisive grew into a practical empire, a supply of men willing to do the visible work, a web of favors and debts, and a reputation that made others think twice before stepping on his toes. He took this as proof that the world yielded to discipline. Small gestures, timed perfectly, could buy you power that looked like permanence. Yet power is a mirror that loves vanity. Reputation invites display. Display invites attention. A life built in shadow is fragile if the owner seeks light. The first time Dean felt tempted, it was not a sudden burst of greed. It was a small, soft thing, a coat. Not a flashy garment in the sense of crass ornamentation, but a coat that suggested completion. It was the kind of piece that announced a man had arrived without shouting it. A friend had sent word that a tailor in town had a piece that matched Dean's silhouette. A dark thing with a sheen and a cut that made a man look like he belonged in any room he entered. He had laughed when they told him. He had no use for vanity, he told them. But that night in the club had planted something like appetite. The look on the boss's face when he realized people had to check their chairs had been gratifying in a quiet, deep way. It felt like owning a fact about the world. Renata found him a week later, standing before the coat in a shop window like a man studying a map he half understood. He had the jacket in hand, running his fingers along the seam as if reading a secret. "Put it back," she said simply. "It looks right," he answered. "It finishes me." "Finishers get finished," she said. The sentence was light, but it landed. There is a rule in Dean's world. Keep inventory of what you wear against the world. Clothes tell stories about the man who wears them. A cheap suit said thrift. A flashy coat said arrival. A coat with the wrong provenance said vulnerability. Renata's warning was not moralizing. It was practical. You do not purchase attention if you cannot afford the cost that comes with it. He bought the coat anyway. Not out of thoughtless vanity, but because a man who had spent years mastering quiet wanted once to feel the thrill of being seen as someone who had made it. He told himself it was harmless, that he could control the narrative. He imagined the coat as a crown that could be hung up as needed, not worn forever. He began to use visibility like a test, a night at a boxing match, a gala where the cameras were indifferent, but the cameras are always the cameras, a handshake with someone who mattered on a channel that matters. Each appearance was a small experiment. Would his infrastructure hold if he let himself be looked at? Could he take the world into the light for a moment and not lose the shadows that fed him? Watching him, Renata grew quiet. "There's a ledger for every look," she told him one afternoon, as they counted names and dates at a table in a diner that no one photographed. "Show too many pages, and someone will audit everything." He nodded because he knew. But habits of invisibility have the same frailty as habits of secrecy. They calcify into the sense that you can control outcomes. He felt for a time that the coat was only theater. He misread the appetite of others for spectacle. He thought the room had learned to listen. In truth, the room had learned to watch. There was an investigator on the other side of the city who had been piecing together threads for months. He was a man with a stubborn moral itch and the patience to follow it through the banal paperwork and noisy rumors. He did not care for theater. He cared for patterns. He watched men like Dean from a distance and noted the way stories accumulated. Who paid whom at whose funeral, who bought what for what cause, who appeared at which event and under what cover. To an investigator, a code is not a fashion statement, but a clue. To a rival, a code is a target. To the public, a code is a brief, glittering story. Yet Dean believed, wrongly, that his ledger was not yet visible. He thought he could wear the coat for a night, and then slide back into shadow. He thought the line he had delivered in the club had bought him insurance, the protection of being counted, and therefore tolerated. He believed, with the kind of faith a strategist allows himself when charm is part of his currency, that he could handle being seen. In the days that followed, invitations arrived with a soft insistence. A charity gala, proper charity, properly attended, offered a stage unlike the club's. It was a place where coats and cameras mattered. The host promised anonymity in exchange for a check. Some nights, a man could feel his name glow without burning. Dean accepted. Renata had asked him to decline. For a week, she said it in different ways. Jokes, warnings, questions that felt like small stakes. "Why do you want the coat?" she'd ask. "Why do you want the light?" He told her he wanted to test something, whether he could be seen without being pinned. He told himself it was about more than vanity. He said, aloud, that being seen might save him time, that sometimes the fastest way to silence a rumor is to be the rumor. Still, as the date approached, something shifted in his comfort. He began to plan the night like a man who has planned hundreds of small moves and finally decides to dance. He told Marco he would attend. He ordered the coat to be pressed. He booked a table near the stage. He rehearsed his hour of presence like a speech. On the night he chose to wear the coat for the first time, the city seemed to fold its breath and give it up. The gala room glowed under chandeliers. Men in evening jackets looked at themselves in polished glass. Women in gowns threaded along conversations that felt rehearsed and private at once. Cameras, discreet and constant, found angles with the patience of predators. Dean walked in and felt for the first time in a long time, clearly seen. The coat settled on his shoulders like a sentence finally finished. He moved through the room and people made the necessary adjustments. Names shifted, chairs swung, old debts seemed less urgent. Marco, stationed by the bar, caught eyes and grinned. Renata kept close but did not shadow him with the clinical vigilance she sometimes carried. For the first half hour, the experiment was a triumph. But vision is a double-edged thing. By lighting himself in a new way, Dean also offered the world a chance to map him. The investigator, who loved patterns, had been tracking small deposits, small public miracles, the way favors clustered. He watched the gala from across the room behind a man with too many questions and a press pass. He took a photograph when Dean laughed, and another when he checked his watch. He made notes about the coat, about the table, about the people who drifted near. In the crowd, a rival's eyes landed on Dean and lingered longer than courtesy required. A whisper crossed the room like static and found a willing ear. People who had once bowed now had a reason to measure the man who now invited their measurement. The coat was beautiful. It was also a bright flag. Dean, feeling the buzz of being center stage, misread the warmth for protection. He thought the old economy of quiet gestures had changed enough that a coat would not cost him the things that mattered. He moved toward the center of the night like a man who thinks the ledger can be reset with a single check. Across the room, the investigator closed his notebook. He had a map now where before he had only stitches. He had a why, in addition to a how. He had the coat on the page to match the parcel at the funeral. He had a pattern. Small public acts that translated to quiet influence. It was not a machine anyone should wish to admire. It was an apparatus. He was ready to follow the apparatus to its vulnerable seams. But this is a story of tactics, not inevitability. For now, the coat hung on Dean's shoulders, and the room gave him the attention he had bought for a night. He laughed at a compliment, shook a man's hand, and climbed the steps toward a microphone he had no intention of using. At the edge of his vision, Renata watched him, with a look that carried both pride and alarm. She understood the beauty of what he'd built. She also saw the way light eats the blind spots that keep an empire from being merely a house of cards. He paused at the top of the room, framed by chandeliers. Cameras found him like moths to a porch light. For a suspended second, he felt certain he had outmaneuvered the world. He had turned mockery into leverage before. He had turned a parcel on a funeral table into a reputation people respected. He had learned the arithmetic of power. A small public sacrifice becomes a balance of favors. He did not yet know how visible a man becomes when he chooses to be. He did not yet feel what the investigator would feel when he saw those photographs pinned to a board. He did not yet taste the particular quiet panic of men who realize a ledger has been read in public. On the floor below, a table rearranged as men who had always looked to the boss began to take cues from the man in the coat. The boss, across town perhaps, or in a different room, was a slow-moving weather system. He could detect the shift and begin to respond. And when old weather meets new, lightning is a possibility. Dean raised his glass to the room, the coat catching the light like a promise. He did not make a speech. He smiled and let the moment be its own currency. For a long time it seemed to pay dividends. Then, as the band took a breath, as the cameras chewed another frame, the room's arc tilted. A waiter brushed past with a tray and bumped a man who was not meant to be touched that night. A laugh, sharp and mean, slipped through the clink of glass. Someone in the crowd recognized the coat for what it was, not just a garment, but a signal. A table that had once been comfortable with the old order found it less easy to be comfortable now. The investigator adjusted his lens and took another picture, his finger hovering like a ledger mark. The first act had succeeded. The second was about to unfold. The waiter's elbow, a small accidental punctuation, unraveled the evening like a dropped stitch. A glass tipped, a man at the next table swore, a whisper ran the room like a fault line. For a moment it was easy to pretend nothing had shifted. For a moment Dean felt the coat hold him the way a promise holds a man, steady, warm, visible. Then someone who had always kept accounts of gestures rather than money caught the scent of opportunity. A rival who never missed cheap theater leaned in and made a quiet call, half offered as a joke and half as a business proposition. Men like that trade in openings the way other men trade stocks. The coat was a ledger entry he could spend. Across town, the investigator's fingers moved slowly across a small stack of photographs and receipts, the way a man smooths paper to reveal a pattern. The gala shots were the last piece he had been waiting for, a public image of a man who had once shuffled parcels at a funeral, then appeared openly where cameras could record him. The investigator did not love spectacle. He loved confirmation. He had suspect, motive, and now a face in a coat to put beside the stories he had catalogued. Patterns are appetite to a man who practices patience. He fed on them. Back at the gala, Dean felt the room tilt. Not violently, not the obvious kind of threat that announces itself with guns or loud threats. It was quieter. A promoter who had been eager to host Marco's sponsored nights paused before he agreed to a new date. A small-time newspaper editor who had once joked on the boss's behalf about Dean's thrift now asked to run a piece on philanthropy. Invitations gathered like rainwater around the coat. Attention pooled and shone. Renata watched every one of these currents as if she were reading the room's weather. Her eyes moved like someone who knows how to measure pressure. For all her admiration for the way Dean wrote leverage into silence, she had always been the person who glanced for the storm drain. That night, the drain was clogged. "We should go," she said, voice a dry kind of calm beneath the chandeliers. He hesitated, as if the decision carried weight beyond the moment. Then he smiled. Not the practiced smile that made Marco beloved, but a private curve that acknowledged a small victory he enjoyed alone. 5 more, he said. 1 more lap. They left later than they should have, and in the space between the gala and their sedan something old and simple happened. An order moved from private planning into the public ledger. A photographer snapped a photograph of Dean stepping into the car, coat in place, hand on the door. and sent it off to a contact who liked telling stories about the way men in the city dressed for success. The image, innocuous as it was, threaded itself into a web the way a single gust threads ash through a room. The next morning, the boss's men read the papers and the feeds the way farmers read the weather. Words travel faster than men sometimes, and rumors run on the little bones of gossip. The boss watched the photograph and understood, in a way that had nothing to do with fashion, what the image meant. A claim, not quite brazen but public enough, had been made. He clenched his jaw for the first time in months. Where Dean had thought the coat a controlled variable, something he could put on and take off like a glove, his visibility became an invitation. The investigator, who had once been content with a thread of rumor and a public ledger entry, now had names to call. He began to assemble interest in the case the way one constructs a bridge, small connections that meet in the middle. He made quiet inquiries, the kind that do not show on paper but are visible on calendars, and men with public reputations who preferred to sleep at night without federal subpoenas started to wonder whether their little favors had been properly recorded. Dean still had options. He had spent years arranging corridors of retreat, and those corridors are useful until they are not. For a while, he moved with the same cunning that had once made a parcel at a funeral speak louder than a speech. He shifted accounts, called in a favor here, discreetly cancelled a meeting there. He made the mechanical noises of a man intent on repair. But visibility has a way of rendering closets' doors and drawing light into what was once a safe cupboard. The first blow did not come with sirens. It came with a knock that sounded too certain for a city where men prefer to creep. It was at his office, a modest room on a less reputable floor of a building someone else insured, that the world he had kept in small compartments met men who did bureaucracy for a living. They moved like a slow tide. Questions first, then a request that is really a demand. There was a moment when Dean looked at the officers in the doorway and thought, not for the first time, how inevitable things are once the world decides to notice. He did not go down without trading something. Negotiation in his life had never been purely financial. It was almost always about illusion, what to let others see and what to keep stitched into shadow. He offered names that the law wanted swept into light and others that it did not. He made the calculus every strategist knows. What can you afford to give, and what will save you? Renata stood quiet in the back, the ledger of people she had tended now sparking questions she had cared to avoid asking in full. Marco's face when they cuffed him was a study in betrayal and calculation. For years, he had been the visible muscle of an invisible operation, the man who took on the public risks so Dean's hands would remain clean. Now his head had become a currency anyone could trade for information. The crowd of men who had once cheered him from VIP sections now had reason to measure their past favors. There was force at play, yes, but it was organized. Arrest, charges, and the slow, grinding machine of paperwork that strips mystique from a life and leaves only the particulars. The investigator, who had once catalogued small gestures with the patience of an archivist, now had enough evidence to call into a courtroom. He presented photos, timelines, testimony. The world that had flirted with the coat's shine found itself summoning judges and depositions. You could tell Dean, to his face and with some justice, that the coat had been the error. You could also understand why a man who had lived in shadows for years might want once in a while to feel his silhouette against the wall. The line between calculated display and vanity is thin and often invisible until the light hits it. At the arraignment, Dean watched men in suits cite his name as if they were discussing a property line more than a man. He heard the words, conspiracy, racketeering, conspiracy again, and tried to map them onto the slow arithmetic of favors he had spent his life balancing. In court, the coat was not mentioned in legal terms. It was, however, an image that circulated, the photo taken as he exited the gala, the coat bright against winter light, a signature moment that fed headlines. The public loves a picture that tells a story in one frame. Renata spoke to the press with a careful economy that tried to save what could be saved without pretending innocence where there was complexity. She did not absolve him. She did not invent sainthood. She spoke to the humanity of choices and the cost of being seen. Her words were precise, a kind of medicine applied to the wound. She believed fiercely in the man who had been her partner, and she also feared the ledger of names that had to be balanced to keep him whole. In the months that followed, aspects of Dean's empire began to contract. Associates flipped under pressure, not always out of malice, but because their own ledgers required livings. Some took plea deals, others went quiet. The boss, who had once laughed at Dean's suit, found opportunity in the tightening. A slow countermove emerged from the margins. Property claims, small violent acts that looked like the work of desperate men, and whispered rumors that made previous alliances look like liabilities. The balance of fear shifted, and Dean felt it like an ache across his ribs. There were still moments when people remembered what the parcel had done for a neighborhood, or the tiny businesses saved from ruin by an unseen guarantor. There was charity, and there was harm, and the two braided themselves into a single history that couldn't easily be separated into heroics and transgressions. Dean's mornings were longer now, filled with lawyers and lists, and his nights were shorter, watched by men who no longer assumed he would not be noticed. The boss, for his part, adopted a posture of cautious truce. He could have burned everything down in a show of force. Instead, he placed his hands on options. He had learned what Dean had always known. Destroying the visible face does not always remove the infrastructure. He also knew that a man now vulnerable is a man to be courted. The boss reached in with old favors and new patience. Where there had been a laugh in the club, there was now a measured conversation. Who keeps the chairs, and at what cost? Months after the gala, Dean found himself back in the club, though not as he had entered before. The place had the same smell of lemon oil and cigarette smoke, the same jazz trio in the corner, but the circle in leather had shifted subtly. Empty space, saved for a different kind of power. The boss sat there with a glass, his smile more like a close calculation than the easy ownership of earlier nights. He caught Dean's eye and did not laugh. He had no reason to. Laughter was a luxury when the arithmetic of control had been rewritten. Dean's suit that night was not the cheap one from before, but neither was it the coat. Neat, serviceable, chosen without ceremony. He had come not to display, but to test the air. He walked the circle with all the quiet dignity he had once used as armor, and by now, as a shield. When the boss spoke, his voice carried the weight of geography, the sort of tone that can tell a man where he stands. "You cost a lot to watch," he said. "You cost men more than you counted." Dean's reply was not the shock of a man pleading innocence. It was a small, flat thing, one of those sentences that draw a ledger line across a page. "I paid what I thought necessary," he said. "Maybe I'm asking for too much this time." They could have settled things with other currencies, threats or bargains, but that was not the scene the city preferred. Instead, they talked like two men who had built economies out of favors. They traded histories, funeral parcels for gala pictures, public gestures for quiet payments. The club listened with the same tender hunger it had when the first line flipped the room. When he left, Dean felt the light on his jacket, but not the same thrill that the coat had given him. The price had been tallied, the ledger had been read in public, and it had asked for penance. The fall did not erase the ingenuity of the calm line in the club months before. That single sentence had rearranged a room and bought a man a dangerous kind of authority. But the line's power had always been tethered to anonymity. Claim the furniture, not the house. When Dean later sought to wear a coat as a crown, he invited a different economy, one that required a cost he had counted too late. In the aftermath, stories formed two tracks. Some celebrated Dean's early moves as genius, how he turned a funeral parcel into social currency, how a single quiet sentence could reassign respect in a crowded room. Others insisted it was hubris, a man who mistook a chair for a throne. Both were true. Truth often wears two faces. Renata kept working the angles of what remained, repairing where she could, protecting who she could. She did not romanticize the man beside her. She guarded the practical things, favors owed, names remembered, Debts settled where necessary to shield a life she believed in but did not sanctify. Her loyalty was not blind. It was a ledger of its own, one she hoped balanced when the day's accounts closed. The boss, who had mocked a cheap suit in a crowded circle and watched the sentence that followed, kept the photograph of Dean in the coat folded in his desk for a while. He treated it like a talisman and a warning. Power in their world is often less about who hits first, and more about who survives the narrative the public accepts. The photograph was both a mark of triumph and a reminder: never mistake visible ownership for permanent control. Dean's name lingered in the street as a cautionary tale and an example, depending on who told it. In some bars, men spoke of the line he delivered like a how-to. In others, they spoke of the coat like an obituary. Both stories traveled because humans love two things: a clever move and a spectacular fall. At the end of everything, the cheap suit that had started the whole story sat on a chair in an empty club one late morning when the light found the room. A cleaner had left it there, perhaps as a joke, perhaps because it had no other home left. It was the wrong fabric for the place, the same blunt hem and threadbare lapel that first caught the boss's attention. A single shaft of light fell across the lapel and made it look, absurdly, like a relic. The boss came in and saw it. He touched the fabric like a man who reads weather in the veins of old trees. He did not laugh. He did not need to. The room remembered the first sentence, and the sentence had done its work. The chair it sat upon had once been the center of someone's authority. The suit was a small monument to the way power can be announced by a gesture, then lost by a miscalculation. Was Dean a genius who understood the currency of silence and used a single line to buy an empire? Or was he a fool who traded the safety of the shadows for the fragility of being seen? The answer lives in both halves. He had been a man of precise maneuvers, of quiet purchases that translated into influence. He had also been a man who, at one point, wanted the coat more than the invisible ledger that feeds an empire. The club kept its secrets and its witnesses. The boss sat and lit a cigarette, the smoke curling like a question over the empty stage. Somewhere, a reporter sharpened a column, and a man in an office arranged photographs on a board. The city continued to turn its balances, paying attention to those who mastered the exchange and those who paid the price for misreading it. Tell us, in the end, was Dean a master of the quiet arts, or a man undone by the light he chose to wear? Comment below, and don't forget to subscribe for more twisted turns where one sentence can change everything.